Well, we're jumping in a little bit early here, but welcome back to the Solution Summit. That's an extra short break. And it gives me a chance to remind you for any panel, you can jump in and out. And don't forget, put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can answer each of those questions and track them better. Some of you are posting questions in the chat. And while that's okay, it's harder to track, so we can't guarantee those questions will be answered. So if you could put them in the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, that'd be really helpful. Now, this next panel asks the question, what does the future of transportation look like? Is it more transit, more bike lanes, more pedestrian paths, electric vehicles, or is it something else? Mariya Frost, our transportation director, is here now with how we're moving beyond transportation as we know it. Mariya?
Thanks, Dave. So my name is Mariya Frost. I'm the director of the Cole Center for Transportation at Washington Policy Center. The Cole Center for Transportation researches and analyzes best practices for relieving traffic congestion with a specific focus on highway and transit projects and how our tax dollars are spent. We support people getting to the places that they want to go, the way they want to get there, not the way that government planners want them to get there. So remember, just as in previous sessions, if you want to ask a questions, you may do so anytime by typing into the chat function. WPC staff are standing by to collect your questions. We will be conducting a Q&A at the end of our presentations. Before I introduce my panel, I want to make a few brief remarks about the purpose of today's discussion. So I want to devote this hour to one idea, that COVID has fundamentally changed the transportation landscape as we know it. And the path forward is one that puts people, not systems, first by prioritizing innovation and improved mobility. To keep throwing public money at transit agencies to do more of the same is not a serious option for policymakers who care about people's freedom to move about as they please and safely access whatever they want and need. To put into perspective the impact of COVID on transportation, consider this. In 1960, roughly 12% of Americans commuted to work by transit. By 2020, that amount fell to about 5%. And at the same time, those who get to work by car has rapidly increased. COVID exacerbated these existing trends, especially as people shifted to working from home. Telework has allowed some families to move farther away because they can work wherever they have a laptop and internet. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the percentage of those who telework has increased from 5% to a possible long-term trend of 20%. And that shift has hit transit hard on top of COVID safety concerns, since many people who can work from home are office workers whose jobs are primarily located in business districts that transit is oriented to serve. The pandemic has exposed the weakness of old transportation systems in thinking about mobility and revealed the importance of flexibility, partnerships, and creative thinking. So that's why I'm so excited to have Bryan, Mistele, and Remi Desa with us today, two of the most optimistic, thoughtful, open-minded, and creative people I know in the transportation world. When things feel bleak on the transportation policy front, a conversation with either of these two gets me excited about the possibilities that exist to improve our freedom of mobility. My first guest, Bryan Mistele, is the president and CEO of INRIX, a leading provider of real-time transportation information, connected car services, and analytics worldwide. INRIX is at the forefront of connecting cars to smarter cities in more than 60 countries around the world. The company leverages big data analytics to reduce the individual, economic, and environmental toll of traffic congestion. Bryan grew up in Detroit, spent time in Boston, and now lives in the Seattle area. He received his bachelor's in computer engineering at the University of Michigan and his MBA at Harvard. He worked at Ford Motor Company and Microsoft prior to starting at INRIX. Let's welcome Bryan to our screens.
Great, thank you, Mariya. So whoever the host is, if you could allow me to do screen sharing, that would be great. I have a couple slides I would like to share with the group. For those of you who are not familiar with INRIX, we're a global transportation data and analytics company based in Kirkland, Washington. So we do look at a variety of different data, and I'd love to share it with you. Hey, there we go. love to share it with you and kind of walk you through kind of what we're seeing from a data point of view, and then what that means in terms of the new reality, both in Seattle and around the world. So I trust everyone can see the slides at this point. Let me start with, as Mariya mentioned, kind of overall ridership and where we're at. Obviously, COVID had a huge impact, more than we've seen in 15, 20 years in terms of overall trips. If you look at this graph, this shows basically trips, both here in the Seattle area, as well as the different areas like Spokane. The dotted lines show overall vehicle-based trips. And if you look at this graph, it's normalized. So what you see is basically for Spokane, Seattle, trips are basically back up to where they were pre-COVID in terms of overall vehicle number of trips. Obviously, people are moving around a lot more, driving, doing obviously groceries, deliveries, that kind of thing. But if you look at transit, which are the solid lines here, you'll see at the different transit agencies, Sound Transit, Spokane Transit, et cetera, we're about half of the ridership that we had pre-COVID. And this kind of makes sense. Part of it is there's a lot of people who don't have to go back to work. But part of it is obviously people are worried about being in enclosed areas, airplanes, buses, light rail systems, things like that, which cause them to take other types of transportation. So this is what we're seeing is overall vehicle trips, individual passenger vehicles, basically return to normal. This is fairly consistent across the United States as well, but transit lags by about 50% what it was pre-COVID. If you look at how it's changed throughout the region, this is even more interesting. The overall number of trips, we're looking at basically people movement in different areas. You'll see basically on the east side, people moving within the east side is down by about 8%. This is, like I said, if you look at the Seattle area, for instance, obviously big employers, Microsoft, Amazon have not required people to go back to work yet. So this is why you see a decline. If you look at people crossing the lake in terms of going from Bellevue to Seattle and vice versa, that's down by 16%, both on the north end through 520 as well as on the I-90 corridor. Why is that? Again, the reason is Amazon and Microsoft. If you're living in Seattle and you're used to commute into Microsoft, or you're living on the east side and you used to commute downtown to Amazon or another tech employer, you no longer need to do that. These companies are still operating virtually for the most part, so you see a 16% drop in the overall trips. The interesting thing, though, is if you look at the overall trips that have increased, it's external to the region, meaning people driving through both the east side and the west side on 520, on I-5 or on 405 has actually increased. So in terms of freight movement, in terms of people moving from, for instance, down to the airport, back up to Everett and back, that's actually increased, whereas people commuting into work has decreased. Probably no surprise to those of you who've kind of driven in the area. What's interesting is if you look at the very downtown cores, the downtown Seattle business district, as well as the downtown Bellevue business district, even larger percent decrease, 25% decrease of trips into downtown core Bellevue and 32% decrease of trips into the downtown core of Seattle. So again, what you're seeing is people are moving again. They're doing the grocery shopping, they're doing recreation, they're going to the gym, they're seeing freight deliveries, that kind of thing. But people commuting in and out of the downtown cores has dropped very substantially, even 2 years after the beginning of the pandemic. This is interesting. If you look at the trip speeds or the distribution of how people are traveling, both in the AM and in the PM commutes, the speeds are higher. And this is for two reasons. One is obviously fewer vehicles on the road, meaning people can drive faster. Obviously, there's less congestion than there was pre-COVID. But also, if you look at the distribution, what you see is people are no longer driving the traditional rush hours. It used to be that people would, you'd see these big blips are obviously around 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and then in the evening between 5 and 6. We used to call these rush hours. You see that flattening out quite substantially. This is because people have more flexibility now in terms of going into work. They don't have to be to work by 9 anymore. They can come into work at 9, they can come in at 10, they can come in at 11, they can leave 4, 5, 6, much more flexibility in terms of employers and the overall commute patterns, which has led to a significant increase in terms of overall speeds of traffic across the region. And then just two more, I'll give you data, and then we'll talk a little bit about what this means in terms of the new reality. If you look at telecommuting, the percentage of telecommuters, as Mariya said, 2019, about 6.5% in Washington state were telecommuting. Now it's at 25%. And if you look across the United States, Washington state is actually one of the highest states in terms of overall telecommuting. California, for instance, is about 23%. And other states, obviously New York, for instance, is about 23%. So Washington state is on certainly the very forefront of telecommuting. The interesting thing is, if you look at the employers, you look at folks like Facebook, who have already made public announcements that they expect about half their workforce to be telecommuting even after the pandemic's over. Many of you are aware Facebook is bought most of the Spring District, and they're putting a very large number of employees over in the Spring District. If you look at Google, who obviously has a campus in Kirkland, Fremont, and they've just bought new property just to the east of 405 in Kirkland as well to expand. Again, they've already made public announcements. They expect employees to work about 3 days a week, but they've shown a lot of flexibility. And then same thing with Microsoft and Amazon. So in terms of telecommuting, it's obviously increased, but probably will remain very high in terms of even post-COVID because of tech companies, certainly in our region, showing a lot of flexibility. And then finally, in terms of data, let me show one more slide. And this is people moving. If you look at the overall movement, there's been more people have moved in the last 2 years on average than in any prior year in the previous 20 years. And if you look at why are they moving and where are they moving to, you've seen kind of a reversal of what you've traditionally seen. If you look at, for instance, the graph on the left, 20% of people who are in a major city have said they are moving. This is people polled who are moving. 20% is because of greater work from home. That work from home no longer requires them to be near work, so they're moving to different areas and likewise suburbs. But you see this being very concentrated in urban areas. More people are moving out of urban areas and out of suburban areas to more rural areas. Why is that? If you look at the right-hand graph, you'll see why. It's because lower cost of living. People want lower cost of living. They no longer need to be in a downtown urban core close to work. They have more flexibility, so they're going to move out into the suburbs, into rural areas where they can afford larger houses, large living spaces, etc. So that is really big changes in terms of our overall transportation. So what does it mean? Let me kind of wrap up with what I'll call the 5 undeniable trends in terms of transportation that kind of signal the new reality. The first is commute patterns have changed probably forever. Obviously, the COVID pandemic isn't over yet, but there's no question if you look at kind of the telecommuting phenomenon, you look at more flexible hours, most companies, I think that have been polled, so those don't go away. I mean, yeah, people come back into the office, but it'll be maybe 3 days a week. Maybe they'll have more flexibility. They'll come in at 10 or 11 instead of having to be there kind of the 9 to 5 traditional hours. And this has huge implications for our society because our traditional model of urban cores, people commuting into a city, our idea of transit has to be radically rethought in light of what's happening. And that's because of the second point here, and that is our urbanization from sort of the beginning of the industrial age, where people moved off of farms into urban areas because that's what the jobs were. That has ended. The net movement of people right now is deurbanization. It's people moving out of the urban cores because they now have more flexibility, because of the internet, because of telecommuting, because of flexibility. And you see that today. My son, for instance, lives in a house. There's 5 guys. He just graduated college. They're all employed at tech companies. One's employed in a company in New York. One's employed at a company in California. 3 of them are employed at tech companies here in the Seattle area, but only 2 of them are going into work. One of them is working virtually and has never been into the office. So people can kind of live now where they want. I've seen people, obviously, we have people that I know in our company who've decided to live in Tahoe for the winter because they like skiing and they live in Park City. So this idea that you have to be close to work is completely changed, and now deurbanization is happening. People are moving out of these urban cores. And what does that mean for transportation? It means flexibility is key. This idea that we're going to have fixed rail systems that are going to deliver people in and out of the urban core has radically changed. Obviously, with COVID, we've seen complete rethinking of the commute patterns. We've seen with movement, people moving out of urban areas, places that we thought people weren't going to be is where they're going because of lower cost of housing. The people where we thought were going to be there are no longer there. So the key here is flexibility, whether it's microtransit, mini transit, ride sharing, employer shuttles, bikes, scooters. You have to have a variety of options. People are going to choose to do what they want to do. You can't force them to live within 2 miles of work anymore. You can't force them to take a bus to work. People are going to live where they want to live. They're going to what's best for them and their families, and they're going to commute the way they want to commute. So we really need to focus on flexibility and how do we enable that from a societal point of view. And then finally, the last two trends, electrification of everything, whether it's cars, whether it's buses, whether it's bikes, scooters, even my lawnmower, everything has gone electric. And it's because of obviously the fundamental cost and technology changes related to lithium-ion batteries. But what does that mean? It means, companies like General Motors have already announced 100% of their fleet will be electrified by 2030. Volkswagen, very similar announcements. The interesting thing is, people thought, Tesla, hey, they're doing well, but they're kind of small. I don't know how many people have paid attention, but Tesla shipped almost 1 million cars last year. General Motors shipped 2 million cars. So this idea that the electrification of vehicles is a niche or it's a small number of vehicles at this point, there's no doubt over the next 5-10 years, the vast majority of vehicles will be electrified. And that applies to buses, it applies to motorcycles, it applies to pretty much everything. So we need to think about that. And the key is obviously the grid. Everyone thinks electric is clean. And it's really not, depending upon where you are. Fortunately, in Washington State, we have hydroelectric, we have nuclear. So our grid here is mostly clean, and that's a very good thing. But that's not true as you go across the rest of the world looking at the grid. So whether this is a good trend or a bad trend really depends on how we manage our grid. And then finally, safety. Safety has become a very big theme in the transportation space, what's called Vision Zero, zero fatalities on the roadways. How does that happen? It's happening primarily through new technologies, what are called ADAS technologies, or semi-autonomous technologies that do things like lane detection. If you try and change lanes into the person next to you, your car won't let you do that. If you try and run a red light, or you try and run a stop sign, the car has cameras that can detect that that's going to happen, and the car will stop for you. So already, even before we get to fully autonomous, you've got a lot of these technologies making their way. In fact, the majority of new shipping vehicles in the United States last year had ADAS capabilities, meaning advanced driving assistance systems, to improve overall safety. So what we see in terms of the future of transportation is quite simple. Much safer because of the new technologies that are being developed in the private sector. We see a much more flexible transportation system instead of a big government-run, government-controlled, inflexible system. Now you've got ride-sharing, scooters, bikes, all sorts of innovation happening in terms of different modes of transportation. You've got a much cleaner transportation system as a result of electrification, which reduces pollution and obviously the adverse effects. And overall, much more efficient system. So I'm quite optimistic about what we see in the transportation system, especially because of the trends in the private sector, and especially now with telecommuting, the ability for people to move where they want to move. You've got a lot more flexibility, much higher quality of life, and hopefully a much more flexible transportation system to meet the needs of what people want. So with that, let me stop there, and I'll hand back to Mariya.
Thank you so much, Bryan. My next guest is Remi Desa, CEO and co-founder of Pantonium, an award-winning smart city company that is reinventing public transit by providing the digital infrastructure to free buses from fixed routes and shift them in real time to routes determined by rider demand and other dynamic changes. Remi was born in Canada and raised in Kenya. He received his electrical engineering and management science degree from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. He worked in the transportation and logistics sector for over 15 years, helping companies like Home Depot move freight as efficiently as possible. Remi took that experience and applied it to moving people instead of packages, applying private sector innovation to a public sector challenge, which is a fantastic example of how innovation in the free market and technology can create new options and deliver superior customer service. Please welcome Remi to our screens.
Thank you very much, Mariya, for that generous introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, just let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. I'm just, oops, wrong button. Sorry, I got a new computer. Okay, hopefully that's good. So yeah, thank you. So wanted to talk today about what we're doing and the work we're doing to really help connect people and places in a more convenient and sustainable manner. And when we look at these two pictures, our goal is the picture on the right. We want to find ways to get more people out of single vehicles, what Bryan was talking about in the trends. But to do that, we really have to get more of transit's choice riders who have options to want to take transit. And the key to that is really all about improving access and convenience for the rider's perspective. But from the city's perspective, we need to really make that service more flexible. And by doing that, you can enable cities to do a lot more with less. So when we think of traditional bus transit, it operates on fixed routes. And fixed routes are really good. They're a way of moving masses in high demand, high density areas efficiently. They provide people with routine and standard options. But the challenge with fixed routes, and especially looking at the trends which are happening right now with more people moving outside of the cities and the sprawl, is wide geographical coverage is very expensive. The reason for that is because fixed routes are relatively inflexible to address uneven density and demand. They work very well, but when you have a predictable demand and density, but because there's a cost every time a bus has to go to a bus stop, it becomes very expensive. The other challenge with fixed routes is because of their nature and how they are designed. Generally, when you look at fixed routes in most cities, you have these star-shaped systems where you have the routes which are designed to bring people to the center of the city. But nowadays, and especially now post-COVID or in COVID, movement is not so much into the center of the city. Movement is across the city. And what happens is a lot of times when people have to move across the city, they have to transfer 1 or 2 times on a bus. And those transfers really increase their ride times. So trips which you could take and drive in 15 minutes end up being an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, just because you have to transfer and you have to wait for the schedule of when the next bus is coming. So because of that, the result is a lot of people choose not to use public transit. As Mariya mentioned, public transit ridership has been declining. And the reason for that is really the cycle of inconvenience. Because the service is inconvenient, demand decreases, and the result of that is you get this service reduction. And in especially low density areas, there is no solution to service that efficiently with fixed routes. You usually see a lot of buses driving around without people in them, and people complaining about the bus service not working well for them. And it's this vicious cycle really just caused by inconvenience. But for us, we believe buses are great tools. They're flexible. They're not tied to tracks. They can be flexible when they're on the road. So why do we make them run like they're trains and they're tied to tracks? Nowadays, technology is a lot more available. We can understand where demand is, where people want to go. So what we do is we look at cities as one large city, and we guide buses between bus stops based on where demand is. So we say the buses are no longer following, say, fixed route. They're going on a journey between bus stops based on where people want to go. And by doing that, we can allow people to get anywhere in the city on one bus without having to changing their trip. So that really helps them reduce their wait times, their ride times, minimizing the transfers. And unlike fixed routes where you have to go to every bus stop, whether someone's there or not, we're only going to the bus stops when people actually are there or need to go to a place. So in real time, we are planning what is the most effective way for the fleet of buses to service that demand. And by doing that, you can create productive bus services, similar productivity as very high productivity product bus services. But we're doing it in a different way because a lot of times when people look at the solutions for cities in an on-demand model, they're looking at it with the hat of the old ways, as Mariya was saying, looking at it at how they service ADA or paratransit type services, which is usually 10 times the cost of a conventional bus trip. So you see a lot of times these small disconnected zones, which are doing first and last miles that are bringing people to the existing bus routes and fixed route networks. But the challenge is those existing bus routes have underlying problems. And there's a reason why people are not using the bus service. So if we want to get more people to use the bus service, we have to start thinking about doing this in a different way. So how does this type of system kind of work? The key to it is really being able to understand where people are going. So we understand that initially when people book their trips, they can do that in multiple ways. Common ways, people who have smartphones can book it on smartphones. But being mass transit, not everyone has access to smart devices or may not have data plans. So it's important to provide abilities for people to be able to board buses ad hocly or set bus stops to be fixed at certain times of the day or allow people to use kiosks to hail a bus. But there are lots of different modes so that you can capture demand. And then what the system does is it's constantly looking at all the buses, what's the capacity of all the buses, where each of the riders are going, how long they've been in the bus for, and figuring out what is the best way for these fleet of buses to service that demand. And then it guides the buses one stop at a time between bus stops, dropping people off where they need to go. And doing this in sort of an autonomous way. It's also important to note that the data that you're able to get from this information is very important because that can help reintroduce fixed routes that make sense because sometimes it makes sense to have fixed routes because for us we believe a hybrid system is the best system where you have efficient fixed routes and on demand working together. But by doing that, you're able to also create regional transportation because you can coordinate with existing train systems or commuter lines and make sure your buses drop people off at the time the commuter train is coming. So you can plan people's trips seamlessly and allows cities to create sort of regional transportation systems just with technology. So I think it's good to sort of run through a bit of how this works in a real case. A good example that we like to talk about is Sioux Area Metro Transit. And they had been really facing a lot of challenges in transit and spent about 7 months studying their system to try and figure out what's a better way for them to operate. And their challenges that they faced were similar to a lot of transit agencies. They had low ridership on all of their routes. Their cost recovery ratio, what they were getting back from their riders compared to what they needed to be subsidized, was quite low. Rider complaints were long ride times, inconvenience, lots of transfers. All the stops in the cities required transfers. Most of the stops, I think about 80%. And as they were trying to cover large areas, it was getting quite challenging to do that in a cost-effective way. So if you look at the map on the top, this map on the top was the initial bus service in the city, and very similar to most cities where in the center of the city is the hub and all the bus routes are coming into the center of the city And so if you need to move around, you have to go into the center of the city and transfer. But very quickly, when we changed to have the entire city run in one zone, they're able to increase the riders per hour. And most importantly, 79% of their trips prior to the service required a transfer. Now 0% of trips required transfers. They were able to cover more stops and significantly reduce the amount of time that people were spending on the bus to get to where they needed to go. And they were able to do this with fewer vehicles. And in buses, in transit, usually the cost per vehicle per hour of service is about $100 per hour. So even saving a couple of vehicles is a significant amount of savings that can be used to deploy service at different times of the day or in different areas where you didn't have coverage before. But that was the first step. The data that we were able to gather from this initial pilot was extremely helpful. We were able to see now the true patterns of where people were going, because a lot of times when cities plan fixed routes, they look at the existing fixed route data. And a lot of times certain routes might show that they have very high ridership and being very productive. But some of the reasons for that could be because there's a Walmart at the stop, and the only way to get to the Walmart is by transferring and getting on this one bus route. So really understanding the true origin and destination of where people are moving and how they're moving can help cities plan a lot better and make better decisions. And that's what we did with Sioux Falls. We were able to work with them, and the next phase is we created a hybrid type of service where we said, this is the main corridors where people seem to be moving. So let's create a fixed route around this area. And coincidentally, it was where the two Walmarts were, and it was creating a fixed route between the Walmarts. But all the other areas, we were able to cover in an on-demand manner and working together seamlessly. So it allowed the city to now provide much more flexible transit, much more cost effectively, and more importantly for the riders, gave them a much more convenient way to get around the city using transit. And that's, Sioux Falls is a great example, but it's not the only example of cities that we've worked in. When we look at cities, usually the biggest drivers that we see in value is about increasing ridership, because by really reducing the wait time, minimizing the transfers, really drives more people coming to use transit, which is good for the system. And secondly, the other side is being able to reduce the number of vehicles that you need to service. So you can run with a lot fewer vehicles because in most cases, a lot of stops are not used on a daily basis. But if you're using a fixed route type of system, you have to go to those stops, whether someone's there or not. So those savings, which you get from that reduction in the amount of buses that you need to use at certain times, can be repurposed to other areas of the city. And, at the end of the day, I always like to end up, public transit is for the public good. It provides a lot of social benefits. It gets people access to jobs. In Belleville, which was the first city that we worked in, there was an independent study done by the University of Toronto, and it found about 60% of the people using their evening service were now accessing second jobs, which they didn't have access to before. And it was very helpful for them being able to do this because it took them a lot less time to be able to get to those jobs than they did before. From an economic perspective, running more efficiently has a huge advantage for a city. And lastly, when we're, but not least, when we're looking at from an environmental perspective, there is a significant value in getting people into single vehicles. And, by providing more convenience, it's important. We have to not only think of we have to think about why are people not using transit. Transit's been a great solution that's been around for a long time. But But it's not just new solutions. We should also look at solutions that we have and how can we make them better to get more people to want to use them. I think that's a question sometimes we forget to think about in transit. So I'm gonna end here. Thank you very much, and look forward to answering any questions.
Well, thank you both so much. And David, I'll kick it over to you for our Q&A.
That's great, Mariya. Thanks so much. We do have time for some questions here, and we'll get started with your audience questions. Don't forget, put them in the Q&A function, not the chat function, if you would, because that makes it the easiest for us to track. Let's start with a question from Sue Lonnie. Have planners taken the new data on trips and plugged it into old models on fixed mass transit?
Sure, so I'll take that one. So let's just say very few is the answer to the question. What we've seen is, obviously the public sector agencies, the MPOs, the metropolitan planning organizations, they have a big investment in terms of fixed rail, in terms of their existing transit systems. So, the fact that obviously you've seen ridership drop by almost half and not recover, very few cities are really rethinking the transportation networks in terms of what they need to do differently. A lot of them are, given the existing investment that they have and the bonds that they have and the debt that they have outstanding related to these systems. Most unfortunately, what I've seen is a lot of them either have their heads in the sand and are trying to ignore it and hoping and praying that when COVID ends, everything goes back to normal, or they're trying to try even harder to get people out of cars, whether it's adding bike lanes, whether it's making it more expensive to come into urban areas, trying to push people into mass transit to get the ridership numbers up so that they can either service the debt or continue to expand their existing system. So I've been kind of unfortunately disappointed in most cities, not all, but most cities in terms of how they've reacted and how they're kind of short-sighted in terms of what I think are more permanent type changes in the commute patterns.
Here's a question that I think a lot of people have. Will the slides and contact information for both presenters be available with these PowerPoints that you were sharing?
Yeah, definitely for me.
Sure, I'm happy to make them available. Mariya, I'll send them to you afterwards and you can figure out how to post them.
Next question this is for you again, Bryan. ACES, when will most of us no longer own a vehicle?
Well, so that's a good question. I mean, the original vision of ACES, autonomous, connected, electric, and shared, was to deliver mobility as a service using a mobile app, an electrified vehicle with no driver, would pick you up, drop you off. It would reduce the number of individually owned vehicles on the road and greatly increase the overall efficiency of the system and decrease the cost of transportation. So that was the vision, and I think that certainly still is the vision most people have, and I think that will be prevalent in many urban areas. The challenge is, of course, people are now moving out of the urban areas, and as more people move into traditional suburban areas where there's lower cost housing, that'll take a longer time in terms of where you see mobility as a service being able to deliver services as effectively or as conveniently as an individually owned car. So there's no doubt you'll see an increase of what's called mobility as a service or MaaS type of services, but I think it'll be a long time until you see 50% of the population using that exclusively as opposed to individually owned vehicles.
For Pantonium, transit agencies measure boardings per hour. 15 boardings per hour seems to be a minimal target for bus lines. Microtransit seems to top out at 4 boardings per hour. They just want your general comments on how this measures and how it'll change in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I think microtransit. So that was a point earlier in the slide. Like the microtransit, I think when people look at microtransit, it's more of looking at it and doing it similarly or the same, where you have these first and last mile solutions, bringing people to the existing bus network. From our perspective, we think there's a way of improving the way the bus service actually works. So when we look at boardings, for an example, our first city that we worked in, we were able to get them to 30 rides per service hour per vehicle, which is extremely different than microtransit, where 4 rides per service hour is considered a very productive type service. But when you look at the cost per ride for that, for the city, it's extremely high. That's similar to paratransit type services where you're $20 to $40 per ride. whereas conventional bus service should be in the range of $4 per trip. So I think sometimes there's a misconception. Microtransit seems to have driven the discussion around on demand, but I think there are other ways to look at on demand as well, which you're actually using your existing network and not just looking at small vehicles and having these small zones feeding into the transit network. And that was what the Sioux Falls example illustrated, where we're using their full-size buses, covering their entire city in one zone.
Next question, regardless of where one stands on mass transit, it seems like what you've laid out creates a bus service that's more efficient and more capable and a lower cost. So what's the resistance that cities have to using your algorithm to improve their bus service? Is there some kind of cost prohibitive factor going on? What is that?
It's not cost. I think it's just openness to change, doing something in a different way. I mean, as you know, most cities are fairly risk averse. The way budgets and are set up is a lot of it is to do the similar types of work that they're doing. You know, where our approach is quite different, and in the cities that we work in, we've had very good success. But I think sometimes the thought is, you know, doing it in the same way or similar way. So when they think of on demand again, they're looking at it at doing it at these test cases in very small areas where it doesn't allow you to really see the value of what on demand can be. So I'd say just resistance to change is probably the biggest holdback for us.
I would add on to Remi's response that I don't think, you know, the federal infusions of cash are helping. You know, the transit agencies across the country are receiving billions of dollars. I mean, record amounts in 2020 when ridership plummeted, just to prop up the agency itself. And I don't see that as a tremendous incentive for the agency to look for those efficiencies and creative ways to deliver service to remaining riders.
Next question, how can we get our legislators and elected officials convinced that the requirements should focus on what people need and want rather than governmental transportation goals in order for them to pursue these wonderfully innovative solutions to people and transportation?
I think I'll start taking that one, and then I can let Remi and Bryan chime in as well. You know, I think it is really, really difficult. As I said, federal government does not help with this situation. But, you know, what the private sector is doing is giving people a taste of options. And I really think that's what they need, is to experience what is available to help improve their trip. We've seen, you know, the city of Seattle try to kill Uber a number of times, and that failed because of the public response. And so, again, I think we need to empower and support the private sector, providing all of these different options to the public. They can experience it for themselves and be vocal about that to public officials and those decision makers. Bryan or Remi, if you're welcome to add additional comments.
Yeah, you know, I guess I would, you know, just echo that comment and say, I mean, the reality is you've got now so many options in terms of transportation. Again, just think 10 years ago, you did not have a Tesla, you did not have, you know, Uber, you did not have, you know, bikes and scooters and things like that. I mean, the unfortunate thing about the free markets is the consumer always wins. But you've got these government agencies that are like, no, we're going to dictate what the transportation policy is. We're going to control it. We're going to say you can only go from point A to point B, et cetera. So people, like you said, will find a way, right? Whether it's, you know, a new type of scooter mobility, whether it's moving now that they can move away from work to wherever they want to live and be more convenient, the market's going to find a way. Consumers find a way to get something that they want. So, you know, trying to swim uphill against that stream or upstream is just not in the best interest of taxpayers. But unfortunately, you've got an existing system where municipalities have already taken on massive amounts of debt, you know, basically tied to and bonded to the revenue from these transit systems. So they've injected the heroin and they can't really pull out the needle at this point. And that's kind of the problem we're stuck in right now.
There's a question about a London Tube study and MIT study of New York City subways showing a 6 times increase in contagion spread on mass transit. And I'm going to summarize a couple of questions together here regarding, the fears of the pandemic and the nature of mass transit, of putting people in crowds together. How do you see that factoring into your work, and how do you see that impacting future transportation trends and government decisions regarding transportation?
I mean, for us, I think when we look at the pandemic and, being able to understand who is going where, how many people, it's very easy. So a good example is one of the cities that we worked in. As the pandemic came about, they initially cut the capacity of the vehicles, of how many people that could go on the vehicles at a time. And they were able to do that very easily and still be able to plan efficiently, because now they had this flexibility, which they didn't have before. I think I hope at some point in the pandemic, I don't think we're ever going to get back to where we were and people are completely open to, there's always going to be some people who are worried about this. But I think, we have to think of, post-pandemic or living in a world where COVID exists. And I think in that world, being able to have a way to plan your trip better and more efficiently, and maybe you can see how many people are on the vehicle. You can make that decision if you want to take that bus or take another ride. You have those options. But I think without having those options and without having that knowledge and availability, we leave a lot to just people to. It's tough to plan that way. So I think our system can help definitely with cities, in pandemic and people worrying about being in places with people together.
Next question is ADAS technology focused on urban driving or all driving situations? Other traffic isn't a big challenge, but might have to avoid a cow on the road or a deer on the shoulder contemplating a bad life choice. How does it factor in?
Yeah, so the easy answer is these technologies are part of the vehicle themselves. It doesn't require communicating to any infrastructure. So yes, absolutely. If there's a cow on the road, that vehicle will stop. Or if you're on a lane in a rural highway and you start falling asleep, it'll detect it and basically keep you from running off the side of the road. So the technologies are using cameras, they're using what are called LiDAR sensors, or essentially light-based sonar type devices, to basically control these vehicles, stop them, keep you from changing lanes or doing something dumb. And those will be in, like I said, almost all vehicles now shipping in the United States. The majority are ADAS equipped. That'll go up to 100% over the next couple of years. And it doesn't matter if you're in an urban area or a rural area.
How are we going to supply the huge amount of electricity that would be needed to power our homes, cars, technology, et cetera? I think you mentioned that in your slides, Bryan. Is there, what is the plan for that, or is there one?
Well, so it depends on where you're at, I suppose. So look, electrification doesn't solve the power problem. It just moves it into the grid. So instead of fossil fuels, now all of a sudden you're plugging into a grid, but the grid needs power, and that could come from fossil fuels. It could come from nuclear, it could come from solar or wind or hydro. So again, those are really energy related questions. And obviously from a policy point of view, the question is, how do you get reliable energy? How do you get cheap energy? How do you get basically that grid powered so that you don't see what you saw in California, where you got rolling blackouts? You don't see what you saw in Texas, where you had blackouts for a certain period of times because of, whether it's lack of wind or sun, those type of things. So you need reliable power, you need cheap power, and then the system works. If you don't solve the grid problem, though, then you can just make things worse. In a lot of places, more electrification is worse because those grids are powered by, either coal or fossil fuels or things like that, which just makes the pollution worse. So, it really is an energy policy-based question, and that really is something that we've got to grapple with as more and more devices just rely on the grid for that energy.
For Pantonium, your conceptual example slide showed microtransit zones in Northwest Seattle, Ballard, and beyond, compared to one macro transit zone. Talk about the existing King County bus network with articulated buses, including an arterial BRT that work on certain arterials, and how your company would suggest potentially modifying this network to be more flexible. That's if you can. I mean, it's a pretty specific request.
Yeah. So when you think about King County, metro areas like Seattle, they have systems. They have lines which work well. They have existing planned networks that work well and have high ridership in certain cases. But I think the challenge sometimes is if you want to move across. So if you're going into the downtown core or following the main commuter lines, you take those types of services. But the challenge is a lot of people who want to move across the grains, it can become quite challenging. So that's really where, in cities like Seattle, we can be very helpful is this cross-grain travel. So you can get across and you don't have to go and transfer a whole bunch of times. Also, evening service, at nighttime, demand is very different. You have shift workers. Those are times where we can be a lot more helpful in how that service works. But yeah, in big metro zones, we're not advocating changing the entire city to run on demand entirely. We want to work with the existing fixed routes, but add a layer of technology to make it run more effectively for the end users and the riders, so it's more convenient for them.
Well, and to Remi's point, also, Wendell Cox did a study for the Washington Policy Center where he looked at commute trips by car and transit, and those downtown trips are about 48%. When you get outside of that downtown core to the rest of just the city of Seattle, that 48% drops to 9%. It's really substantial, and that's where on-demand transit, I think, could be really useful where those, that ridership market share is so low.
Next question for all panelists. Transit agencies are now focused on frontline workers with jobs that are not compatible with telecommuting and on people without cars. Comment on how that would work. Or just a general, do you agree?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's no question that obviously the focus for transit are people who are actually commuting as opposed to people who are telecommuting. I'm not sure I understand the question though, in terms of, obviously the focus, if you believe it, is the transit agencies to move people around effectively and efficiently. But yeah, for telecommuters, I don't think there's been a real good appreciation of just how many people are going to be telecommuting or doing flexible work plans moving forward, because it is fairly radical at this point.
Yeah, I just add, I think in transit, you have two groups of riders. You have transit dependent folks who don't have other options, and you have choice riders. And for the transit dependent folks, I think it's still important to be able to give them better and more convenient options. But it's also important to make that convenient so you can get more of the choice riders. And working together, I think convenience, accessibility really helps everyone.
Well, and I guess, my input on this is, I think for, folks who are firefighters, nurses, other, people who are considered essential employees, my mother is a nurse. It's, as Remi said, I think it's really important to dignify them with better service, especially because they have such irregular hours. Nobody wants to board a bus, at least I don't, by myself at night after getting off of work. We're standing at a bus stop for an inordinate amount of time, in a city. I think it would be much better for me to be able to plan that trip if I am transit dependent, to know exactly when to go outside so I can get on the bus safely and get home without having to transfer. To me, that would be ideal and would certainly make transit more attractive and more viable as a mobility solution.
Well, to all of you, you really sparked quite an interest. There's more questions that continue to pour in. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I don't think we've ever left this many questions on the table before. So I'm sure Mariya will be taking a look at those moving forward and try and answer some. Thank you, Bryan and Remi and Mariya, for that fascinating discussion on the future of transportation. For more on our transportation work here at WPC, just go to our website at washingtonpolicy.org. Thank you all for joining us today. All right, the Solution Summit is going to continue here after a short 5-minute break.